Welcome back, everybody. My name is David Santacroce. I teach here in the clinics and dabble from time to time in the Eighth Amendment. We've got a distinguished panel today that's going to talk more specifically about the crisis in Michigan. I'm going to try to stay out of the way and let our panelists do the talking. First up is going to be, all the way to my right is Jeff Gerritt. Jeff's been an editorial writer, was an editorial writer for the Detroit Free Press for about 12 years. He's focused on prisons and criminal justice and urban issues. He recently was named the deputy director for the Blade in Toledo, Michigan's loss. He's been, if anyone's ever read Jeff's stuff, it's clear, to the point, and always kind of a little ahead of what seems to be people are going to start talking about next. He's been nominated for the Pulitzer Prize 3 times. He's won a host of awards, and he's an engaging guy, and is always a snappy dresser. So we're going to pass it over to Jeff.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, David. Appreciate that. I kind of punk out here a little bit. I hate to apologize for being a little discombobulated, but actually, as David said, I was an editorial writer and columnist for the Free Press for 12 years, and 2 months ago I took a job as the deputy editor of the Blade in Toledo, and today is my move day, and I got an accident down in Toledo going over to my place. The elevator wasn't working, and somehow I lost my wallet, so I'm a little discombobulated. But as David said, and I'm proud to be here with this panel. I've worked with all of them throughout my 12 years in writing at the Free Press. Mainly, much of my work was focused on prison issues. To be honest, one of the reasons that I did take the job in Toledo, besides being a lot more money, was that they were pressuring me at the Free Press a little bit to write less about prisons. You know, they were saying, we're tired, just prison, who cares about this stuff? And I was getting a little tired of fighting them on it, to be honest with you. So, but in my 12 years of covering the correction system, I've been in every prison in Michigan except for one. With 33 prisons, there's 47,000 prisoners in Michigan. I've gone in as a journalist, mainly as a speaker. Inmates who know me frequently invited me in to speak in prisons, and as a visitor. I have a brother-in-law who's locked up in prison, so I've gone in as a visitor many times too. So I've seen the prisons from all those angles. In fact, he just spent 3 months in solitary, speaking of segregation, for having a cell phone on his possession, and wrote me some letters while he was in there. And of course, he bought the cell phone from a corrections officer. That's not to excuse him, but what happens is that when inmates get drugs or phones, 99% of the time they get it from correctional officers, and the families suffer because they tighten security, but they don't seem to look at the real focus of the problem, which is that these corrections officers are bringing in the contraband and making a lot of money off it too. And the inmates pay for it, and the families of the inmates pay for it. 33 prisons, 44,000. The last piece I did before I left the Free Press was called Criminal Negligence, which dealt with mentally ill and the segregation issues. I was very happy when I walked in here to see Kevin DeMott, who was one of the prisoners I interviewed. He was in segregation at the time in the UP, and it's just great to see him out with a smile on his face. And there's one of the real pleasures of doing the kind of work I do is when I see inmates and on this side of the walls. And Kevin, welcome home. Your mom told me you were out about 2 weeks ago, and that's just fabulous. But Kevin was having a pretty tough time of it in seg. And there's one of the things about the mental illness is in segregation is there's about 1,000 people in seg in Michigan's 34,000 prisoners. That number has dropped. I give the department some credit for that. I think I had lunch with Russ Marland. He told me that they had gone down from about 1,500 5 or 6 years ago to 1,000. And they do have some programs like at Alger Correctional Facility where they have incentives. It's a pilot program where they give inmates who are in SEG incentives. If they follow certain rules, do journaling, they get more privileges, get to go to the law library, get a television, get one phone call a month, and they claim that that's cut down on their SEG time by about 10%. So the department always says, we want less SEG too, because it's very costly for us. It's about $35,000 a year to house a single inmate. In SEG, it's about double that because there's single cells, there's more attention. So they'll always come back and say, we want to do this too. But the fact is they're not doing it as fast as they can. Once inmates are in SEG, they're in these 8x10 cells. Kevin knows this a lot better than I do. 23 and a half hours a day, get out maybe a half hour a day for exercising, and the few privileges they have in prison are taken away. So, and I talked to one guy in one of the UP prisons that was in SEG for 12 years. So this is not necessarily a real temporary thing. Weeks, months, years can go by where people stay in segregation. About 25% of the inmates in the Department of Corrections are mentally ill. That's the department's own estimate a few years ago. Now they're saying it's maybe 17 or 18. University of Michigan is still sticking with 25, but 25 is a pretty good number. So you figure that's about 10,000 people in the prison system who are mentally ill. Now in segregation, I don't know how many numbers are mentally ill in SEG, but the department has acknowledged to me that a greater share of inmates in SEG are mentally ill than the general population. So you figure 25% of those 10,000 are mentally ill. And that makes a certain kind of sense because prisons are dictated by security, and if you're mentally ill, you're not getting your meds, you tend to act out, you get in more fights, then you get held in SEG, where your condition, of course, worsens because you're deprived sometimes of your medication and you're not getting treatment and so forth. And although the department has some administrative rules that say they're not supposed to put mentally ill people in SEG, I had lunch with Russ and he said, well, that's not what the legislature really intended. He's had discussions, so they do it anyway, and he said it's unavoidable. But there's really some pretty strong language in the administrative code that mentally ill people are not supposed to be in SEG. So I first got interested, as I said, I did this series on mental illness in the criminal justice system because I had been covering prisons for so long. I had seen so many mentally ill people. Some of you may have read the stories I wrote about Timothy Saunders. That was something that Pat Streeter here held my hand through. She was an extreme help for me in that, but we exposed the death of a 21-year-old mentally ill person who had been in there for stealing a paintball gun at a Meijer store. And he had some misdemeanors, very small stuff, nonviolent stuff, started acting out, ended up during the jail time, he tried to hang himself with his jail suit. He got charged with malicious destruction of police property. And this is the kind of thing that goes on with mentally ill. Somebody hangs themselves with a jail, instead of giving him treatment, they charge him with malicious destruction of police property. So he ended up in a hot segregation cell for 4 days, strapped down, and he died 4 days later, naked and soaked in his own urine. And the mother of the family learned how her son died by reading my story in the Free Press. She had no idea how he died. She knew that he had died, but she had no inclination of why. So, and that story ended up on 60 Minutes 4, 5, 6 later. But Dr. Cohen was very much involved with that, and Pat Streeter gave me a tremendous amount of help in that entire series. So that's how I sort of got involved with understanding the plight of the mentally ill in prison, and particularly in SEG, which is what we're here to talk about today. And I think I've probably gone over my limit, so I'm going to pass it over to, who's next, David?
Thank you, Jeff. Next up is Dr. Robert Cohen. He's a clinical instructor in the Department of Medicine at the NYU School of Medicine. Dr. Cohen is, at least in my small world, is kind of a legend. He's worked for over 30 years as a physician, administrator, and court expert on Eighth Amendment issues for inmates. He was a director of health at Rikers Island for a while. He's a current member of the New York City Council to represent the to represent the APHA on the New York City Board of Correction. Perhaps most saliently here, he's a federal court monitor overseeing efforts to improve medical care for prisoners, and he's done this in Florida, Ohio, New York State, Connecticut, and in a very prominent case here in Michigan and Haydix v. Caruso. Dr. Cohen?
Thank you very much. Thank you. Sorry, someone know how to get this started? Okay, there we go. Right, so this is the title of my talk. It's going to talk a little bit about Timothy Saunders and talk a little bit about the medical consequences of solitary confinement, and end by talking about whether our decisions and our policies and our practice on solitary confinement should be guided by the consequences of solitary confinement, or it should be guided by a more fundamental sense of justice and a recognition of the cruelty that solitary confinement, prolonged solitary confinement represents. So I want to begin by talking about the very important case in this area, which is Madrid v. Gomez. This is 1995. Pelican Bay was mentioned, and Craig talked about it, showed you pictures about it. I haven't been there yet, but I'll be visiting soon. And a case was brought against solitary confinement in this prison in Northern California, which I guess is 8 hours from San Francisco and 1 million hours from LA. And one of the most wonderful judges in the United States, Thurton Henderson, was the judge in this case, and he ruled that it was cruel and unusual punishment. It was a violation of the Eighth Amendment to keep people who were seriously mentally ill in prolonged segregation. That was clearly cruel, and he took them out of segregation. Also dealt with other medical issues, and he said, conditions in the SHU, as Craig also said, these units are called SHU, Special Housing Unit, Segregation, Solitary, the Hole, the Box, the Bing on Rikers Island. Conditions in the SHU may well hover on the edge of what is humanly tolerable for those with normal resilience, particularly when endured for extended periods of time. They do not, however, violate exacting Eighth Amendment standards, except for the specific population subgroups identified in this opinion, which are the seriously mentally ill. Now, it's hard to imagine why a judge of Judge Henderson's caliber would say such a thing based upon what I know about solitary confinement. And I think we've heard a number of people comment on this so far today, and we'll hear more. But I'll continue. So this is Timothy Saunders, I had been appointed for about a year or so as the associate monitor. There had been a previous monitor. The case of Haydix v. whoever the commissioner is of that time, I think began in 1976 as a U.S. case, as a Department of Justice case, and then became another case that's been going on for a long time, and it was just about settled when serious medical issues were raised to Judge Richard Engelin, who was the judge at the time, and he decided to appoint another monitor to the case to try to help solve the medical issues, and I was honored by Judge Engelin to accept that position. And I'd been there for about a year, and I was preparing for a hearing that we were going to have in September, and it was early August, and I planned a 3-day visit to the Haydix facilities to review the care. And I'd heard a couple of days before I was due to arrive that there had been a death at the prison. And I was informed that it was an expected routine death. And I arrived in Michigan, and I went to the prison on the morning of Tuesday, I think, following a few days after his death, and asked to see the medical record. I was not given the medical record. They said it was some kind of, it was in some kind of process, and they would get it for me. And I was reading a book at the time called The Good Doctor by Damien Galgut, a book I recommend to all of you. It's a South African novel about a doctor who was doing his official national service in a hospital in rural South Africa. And one day, the head of the hospital, who he reported to, was out of town. And he, therefore, had to respond to a request by the military to evaluate one of their prisoners. And the prisoner was brought to him, and the guy was obviously in terrible shape. He'd obviously been beaten up a lot. He was covered in dirt. He was short of breath. He was wheezing. He was crying. And the doctor was asked, is he okay? Can we continue to interrogate him? And the doctor said, I can't even tell. He's covered with dirt. I just don't know. They said, well, let's wash him off then. So they washed him off, and they said, is he okay to test for us to continue interrogation now? And he said, I don't know. I need to examine him. This is, Eventually, after he was given a stethoscope and evaluated him, they said again, is he okay for interrogation? And he said yes. And the book is about the degradation of his life that followed that decision on his part, of his personal life, of his economic life, of his sexual life, because he. Anyway, I was reading this novel, and then the second day I was there, I was given, by the Department of Corrections, who have always been completely cooperative with all of my requests. I was given a copy of the chart, and I read a chart about this 21-year-old man who had a severe history of medical and psychiatric problems, who was on 5 antipsychotic medications, who was being treated for 21 was being treated for hypertension and elevated cholesterol levels, had attempted suicide on 5 occasions, including by attempting to eviscerate himself, by walking into traffic in front of cars, by hanging, and I read the chart and saw that he, saw what happened, and then I requested from Corrections a copy of any video that had been taken during the time of his incarceration in the special housing unit, which they provided to me. 4 days, 4-point restraints, and he died from dehydration and hypernatremia. I'll return to this. So, are there medical complications of being in solitary confinement? The literature is not strong on this. I think that I know that there are. I work very closely with the Department of Correction in Michigan to try to assure that people in segregation, in the SHU, were getting medical care, because it's been my experience throughout the country that people in the box are not, treated, do not have the access they need. And so I worked with them, and there was a clinic that was present in the box area. I made sure that they had a computer system that was linked to the computer system, and the department cooperated in getting that there. I worked with them to make sure that doctors examined patients, that patients from punitive segregation would be seen without being manacled, when they, unless there were special circumstances. So it was something that I've always been concerned with, and the department, was cooperative in my suggestions regarding that. But nonetheless, Timothy got lots of medical attention during those 4 days. He was seen regularly by doctors and nurses, but he was tied down for 4 days, becoming increasingly psychotic and dehydrated, and to some extent incoherent, but in some very fundamental way, the only coherent person, the only person who understood what was going on in the special housing unit that hottest week of the summer of August 2006. So, in Wisconsin, a few years before, I was asked to review the medical care of a 21-year-old man who was held in the Supermax in Wisconsin. He had epilepsy. He was in the Supermax. He was having uncontrolled seizures. He stopped taking his medication. The other prisoners who he was communicating with in the segregation area understood that he was having lots of problems. They called for the security staff to get him help. The security staff called the nurse who was on call, who said, "Keep watching him, call me if he stops breathing." he did stop breathing. And the nurse was called, and there is videotape of a squad there are squads in prisons who go into segregation areas, who go into when there are cell extractions. A cell extraction squad followed by the doctor took the cell extraction 3 minutes or 5 minutes to get there. They then went into the cell. I think he was lying on his back. They turned him over on his front. They handcuffed him in the cell. Then the doctor came in to examine this man who was dead. This is also on video. So are there risks? Are there medical risks of being in punitive segregation? Certainly there was for Mr. Jackson, this young man. I monitored medical care in Ohio State Penitentiary in Youngstown, Ohio, which is a supermax facility for a number of years. And when I was there, I noted the following: that prisoners, nobody was getting any pain medication, that there was serious problems in getting specialty care, that physical examinations only took place with someone chained to a table. And I asked the doctor how he could examine people, with abdominal pain when they were chained up. He said it was difficult. I was reviewing the care of diabetes in this prison, and if you have diabetes, when you if you have insulin-dependent diabetes, you have to inject yourself multiple times a day, usually with insulin. And you're supposed to rotate the sites of injection so that you can assure that there'll be reasonably predictable absorption of insulin. If you give it in the same place all the time, that will not occur. And the nurses were charting. They had a special page to say where the injection was given. And I reviewed the insulin injection pages, and everyone was getting injected in their umbilicus, in their belly button. Always in the same place, always right in the middle. And I asked them why that was the case, and who knows why that was the case? Excuse me? No, at this point, no, it was through the food slot that we saw in Craig's picture. So the prisoner would put their belly up to the food slot, and then they would get the injection. So I said, can't do this. I'm the court. I said, you can't do this. And so for a brief period of time, it stopped. But what it meant to stop was that the prisoners had to put their hands through that food slot, be back cuffed, then go to the back of their room. 3 or 4 people in riot squad would then come in, chain their bellies, chain their ankles, tie them together, and then hustle them out to a room down the corridor where they would then get their insulin shot. So this was a problem for the correction staff. This was a problem for the prisoner. This was a problem for the nursing staff, who would be waiting for hours to do the shot. And so there was a collaborative decision actually made to do what was being done. It was not a good idea, but that's bad things happen in segregation. Everyone is deformed by prisons, and everyone is particularly deformed by segregation. I am on the Board of Correction in New York City right now. It's a 9-member board who oversees the Department of Correction. We actually make the standards for medical care, for mental health care, for segregation, for visiting, for everything. And I'm honored to be appointed that by the President of the City Council. And in August of this past year, a young man who was mentally ill, who was in the punitive segregation unit for the mentally ill, which is called Maui on Rikers Island. There was a backup in the sewage in Maui. Prisoners were given soap balls, which are ammonia-like substance, to dissolve in containers of water, then to clean up their own cells, which were filled with the backup from the sewage backup. This Mr. Echeverria swallowed the soap balls. And he then called out for help, and he saw a med tech who was distributing medications in the area, and she ran around to tell the captains and all the officers that this was going on, that he had to get out. He was in tremendous pain, and he might die from this. And for 4 hours on videotape, nothing happened, although the captain and other officers periodically went over to the cell to look at him. Then there was a power failure, so the cameras went off, and that morning he was found dead in his cell. So bad things happen in segregation. In general. Lack of access to medication, not the case on Rikers Island generally, but actually it probably is the case on Rikers Island, and in general, as you described, this is deep within the system, and it's less accessible, and people are trying not to remember who's there. So all kinds of problems happen. There's lack of access to emergency care, which I just demonstrated, to chronic care, to off-site specialty care, and preventable deaths occur. I could say more, but I won't. This is, I want to talk about jails, because actually we have some data now on segregation in jails in New York City. This is collected by the Department of Health following a series of deaths that occurred in the past, which were predictable. Actually, one death that occurred after 45 facial fractures occurred in a 6-month period in the juvenile facility. And and this is obviously an unusual situation, but finally someone was killed, and it turned out to be an internal extortion ring run by corrections and prisoners, where if you did not give up your commissary and other things, you would be beaten up. And that's why everybody was getting their jaws fractured, and then one young man was killed. And after that point, the Department of Corrections started collecting data. The Department of Health, which runs the medical services, started collecting data. Now, this is solitary confinement on Rikers Island over the past 3 years, and you see in fiscal year 2010, there were 720 people in solitary confinement, and the first quarter of this year now, there are 1,035 people in solitary confinement. So you have a 50% increase in solitary confinement. So although I'm also not as hopeful as everybody else, but I'm somewhat hopeful. In New York City, even though it's a liberal town, even though overall the population of the jail actually has gone down 10% during that period, the population of segregation has gone up 50%. I mentioned this thing called Maui before, a recognition based upon Madrid, based upon all kinds of other cases, based upon our general notion that prolonged punitive segregation is dangerous for people with serious mental illness. There's a special unit for people who have infractions, but are mentally ill. And it was started in 1990 with 16 cells, and you can see it's Malthusian growth over the next period. So now there are 290 people. There's supposed to be programs. They're locked up 23 hours a day. There's supposed to be mental health programs for these people. Psychologists, social workers, psychiatrists once a week, group therapy. Only half of those sessions ever occur. And there's a fundamental conflict in this unit because the correctional staff believe that people are claiming to be mentally ill to avoid going to the real punitive segregation area. So in Rikers Island, the punitive segregation is called the Bing. I can't give you the origins of that term. And these people are called Bing beaters, a term of derision. And that's just some interesting data. So as the population of solitary beds on Rikers Island increased during the past 5 years, actually mainly over the past three or 4 years, the number of serious self-harm, these are serious gestures. These are that required emergency room or urgent care medical attention, also increased in parallel. Of note, for people with mental illness, their average length of stay, this is in a jail, New York City, was 70 days if they were mentally ill, 50 days if they were not mentally ill. And now, there were 245,000 people admitted to Rikers Island during this 2-year period. Many of them came in more than once, and there were about 2,000 gestures, and many people were recidivists within that. But the chances of a serious self-harm occurring if you were mentally ill versus not mentally ill was 8 or 9 times as great. Now, if you look at serious physical injury for people in the jail, if they were in solitary confinement at any time during their stay, they had an 8.5 times chance of having a serious physical injury occur. So there is a danger to physical danger, medical complication of solitary confinement in a large urban jail. This has not been published yet, but the Department of Health gave me permission to show these slides. Age is also a factor. Traditionally, we think that suicide occurs usually among first offenders when they're young, and this is consistent with that, although it's not that high a number. And I guess recent data has suggested that age is not as important as we once thought. But length of stay is also not that important, but it's the longer you are in, the greater the risk. And so what we see is that of anybody who was in solitary during this time, during this two-year period, who had an active self-harm, anybody had a 50% chance of an active self-harm, but only 8% of patients were in solitary. So the chances of it occurring were six or seven times greater an active self-harm if you had spent any time in solitary during this thing. So I'm going to finish by showing Mr. Stoudamire again, and just to say again that at 16 or at 36 hours, I don't remember, and I couldn't look at the tapes again today in preparation for this. He said, "What are you doing? 36 hours. I've been 4-point restraints. What are you doing?" And they said, we're just doing what we're doing. We wanted to get you to the mental health unit at another facility, but the bus didn't come, and So he was, so who's crazy? Who's mentally ill? Is my question to you. And now there's a case that Craig is involved in, and I'm involved in, which is called Ruiz v. Brown. This is taking place at Pelican Bay. The case was filed in 2012. The previous case at Pelican Bay I mentioned was in 1995. And this is a case arguing that prolonged solitary confinement is a violation, is a constitutional violation, even though Judge Henderson didn't think it was. And the case involves a select class of people who are at Pelican Bay in solitary confinement who have been there for more than 10 years. And that currently is about 520 people. Again, I say, who's crazy? What does it mean to put someone in solitary confinement for 20 years? So what is to be done? And the UN rapporteur says 15 days maximum for solitary confinement, never for people who are adolescents, never for people with serious mental illness. I don't know what the number is. It should be used with, it shouldn't be used so much. You should train staff to recognize that bad things happen in solitary. And enforcing empathy. I don't know how to do that. But it was raised in the early discussion. I think it's a critical issue. We all have ways of answering ethical and difficult questions. What would I do for my sister? There's something about the heterogeneity of the society, which is race and other things, which allows us to function sans empathy within prison. So what can we do to make that different? I'm not going to answer that. And finally, although there are medical consequences of solitary confinement, and there are profound mental health consequences of prolonged solitary confinement, whatever the magnitude of those are, and almost even if there were no consequences, it is inhuman, it is degrading, it is cruel, and it's torturous. We really have to do something about this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Cohen. Next up is Patricia Streeter. Pat is a civil rights and federal criminal defense attorney here in Ann Arbor, Michigan. Like Elizabeth Alexander, who comes after, if you've got a prison rights case, you've got to have Pat's name in your Rolodex. She was the 2008 Trial Lawyer of the Year for her outstanding contribution to public interest law. Her academic research focuses on the right to fair trials. And I'm not going to say any more. Take it from here.
Thank you. Well, I'd like to just say how wonderful it is to see everyone here today, and I'd like to thank the organizers and the students for attending. It's really exciting to see young people starting to think about some of the issues that we've raised today. So again, I commend you and thank you very much. I've been litigating against the Department of Corrections in Michigan since about 1982, when I joined a team of lawyers that were helping prisoners who had started their own litigation. In 1980, they filed their own case that was called the Haydix versus Johnson case at the time. And over the years, with the change of the director, the defendant name would change. And the most recent iteration is the Haydix versus Caruso. But they had claimed a number of different violations. In the parlance, are called conditions cases, everything from sanitation in the housing units, food service, medical care, safety from harm from other prisoners. And over the course of time, we settled a number of the issues, leaving predominantly just the health care. Mental and medical health care have been the issues of the last decade or so. And at this time, there's myself and Elizabeth Alexander, who's also on the panel, and we have a third attorney, Daniel Korobkin, with the ACLU Fund of Michigan, who is also on the case. But over time, as I say, we've seen a lot of medical and mental health conditions that have been very upsetting to us. And before I go farther on the medical issues, I want to mention one of the topics of this symposium involves race. We did not litigate race in the Haydix case, although over the years I've heard complaints of prisoners of different races that sometimes I think behavior of staff has been racially motivated. And as many of you know that have ever tried to look at trying to prove racial discrimination, it's very difficult. But there were not as many complaints now as there used to be, say, for example, in the 1980s, where I would be told of guards that would wear cowboy-style belt buckles with the KKK on it, and would roam just brazenly leaving it out there, so there was this constant racial hostility. You don't hear that as much anymore, and that's due to a lot of training that's gone on over the years, in my view. But there's still the possible cultural issues that can develop, particularly in the healthcare area, where you have the patients who are African American and some of the physicians and healthcare staff, or mental health care staff who come in who are not American born and don't have English as their first language. There's maybe a cultural hostility that can develop, and it not only causes hostility, but it could lead the way to some misdiagnosis or failure to treat. So it's a possibility, but again, it's very difficult to prove. Now, as our expert in the Haydix case said in our hearing on mental health, Dr. Terry Coopers, segregation is toxic for the mentally ill. And Dr. Cohen has talked a little bit about Timothy Saunders, who was 21 years old when he came to Jackson. At the time, it was a facility within the Jackson prison called JMF. And I want to give you a little bit more background of his circumstances so you can see how a confluence of events led to his death. He had been prescribed psychotropic medications before he came to the facility. He came in March of 2006. And those medications made him susceptible to heat, what we call heat injury. Some medications will tamper with your body's ability to regulate your temperature, your internal thermostat, so to speak. So if you're on some of these medications, you can't sweat. You don't sweat to control your temperature, for example. And so as a result, after several misconducts, as you heard, During a very hot period of time, it was a heat alert at the prison. Mr. Saunders was so hot, he went and just took a shower to cool himself down, as we learned from some of the prisoners in the unit later. And because he got a ticket because of that, a misconduct. He went to the shower when he shouldn't have, and for that he was sent to segregation, which itself was not only comprised of cells that were like boxcars on a train. Itself was on the 6th floor, 5th floor of a very large housing unit and had no ventilation in it. No ventilation on the floor, no ventilation within the cells. So he had the reaction with his medication, the heat, and you could see from the videotape that we ultimately got, and by the way, thanks to the family, we got permission to disclose those tape recordings openly in court, and they were also used in the 60 Minutes feature that was done, and that is still linked on the ACLU website, on the national website, if any of you want to take a look at that. But you can see when I had to view like the 8 days of recordings to create the evidence that we used. You can see how he came in, how he looked. The photograph you saw here was toward the end. And the day he died, they finally got him out to go to a shower. And he was so weak and he was unable to stand. They had to go get a wheelchair to wheel him back to his cell. And it was just a horrible, slow way to die. And watching the decline of his health over those days, it's just unimaginable how so many people could see this and not take steps to prevent it. So it serves as an example how it can happen. And as several speakers have mentioned, the segregation unit it's a sort of a hidden little area within the prison, and the staff don't go there regularly. The custody staff don't go there regularly, so he just died in just horrible, torturous conditions. So I will not finish my remarks in the interest of time. I can always come back and talk if there are questions toward the end. I will add, though, that as a result of all of the evidence that we produced, the judge issued a very scathing opinion, and shortly thereafter they closed the unit, and which is probably good for many prisoners, but at the same time it meant that we lost the ability to see what is going on in the prison in some of these areas. We still have jurisdiction over the reception and guidance center, and those issues will be litigated probably later this year. So I'll stop there and I'll take questions at a later point. Thank you.
Thank you, Pat. Last and certainly not least is Elizabeth Alexander. Elizabeth is also kind of a widely known and well-regarded lawyer and prisoner rights advocate. She's argued 3 cases before the U.S. Supreme Court, including Farmer v. Brennan. She's involved in the Haydix case, and she is the director of the National Prison Project of the ACLU.
Actually, I'm the former director.
Former director.
I'm in private practice now. You know, it is just a tremendous pleasure to be here. This is a wonderful thing that the symposium, that the journal has done in so many ways. So many of the other speakers are my personal heroes and friends. Also, this is a topic that combines something that's just right now a tremendous focus of national energy to get something good done in the human rights area, and at the same time, the symposium is so correct to link it to particular problems here in your home state. You know, Michigan is a wonderful progressive state, but there are real problems in your correction system. And let me also return to a case from the early days of the Haydix litigation. Around the same time that we filed Haydix, I wasn't involved in filing Haydix, but I was involved in filing what was sort of a companion case to Haydix, Knott v. Johnson, also in the 80s. And that was a case that did have one of its issues was racial discrimination within the Michigan prison system at particular prisons. And we got an order from the district court in that case finding that there was a pattern in practice of staff racial harassment of African American prisoners, and the court ordered some injunctive relief for that. That went up to the Sixth Circuit, and the Sixth Circuit reversed that on the grounds that we had failed to sufficiently. While we'd shown that supervisory staff had condoned this, and that they knew about this pattern in practice, we hadn't shown that they had sufficient evidence that they had encouraged it. Well, among the other things that we had shown, and that the district court found, was that there were very serious disparities in employment in good prison jobs, to the disfavor of African American prisoners, and that there were serious, and going to Margot's point from the morning, there were serious disparities in assignment by race to the prison system. One might have thought that it's relevant to whether a just system would do something about a pattern and practice of racial harassment, that all these things were true. So that's something of the background. To add to what Pat said about what may have changed for the better on this in the Michigan prison system, I think one thing, at least my sense is, that now there's a much higher level of employment of African American staff, at least in the lower part of the state's prisons. I have no idea about the UP, which were particularly heavily all-white staff. But my sense also is that there's not the sort of obvious racialism when you walk into the prison system that there used to be, and that's a good thing. Now, you've heard from all of the other speakers something about the terrible situation of Timothy Saunders in the segregation unit. And by the way, right before Timothy Saunders died, he asked a nurse to check his pulse. The nurse checked his pulse, and he asked whether she could find it, and the nurse said, yes, faintly, then walked away, and there was no treatment. And that seems to me symbolic of a number of problems that I want to talk about as a general problem about the combination of prisoners at risk from health problems and the use of segregation. And to do that, I want to talk about a completely different Michigan prisoner, ex-prisoner, who, as it happens, is also a client of Ms. Streeter and me. And that is Martinique Stoudamire. When she came into the prison system in 2002, she came from a childhood in which she had had lupus, which is an autoimmune disease, and which can cause a number of complications, including amputations and various organ failures. But when she entered the prison system, none of these complications had happened to her. Well, by the end of 2005, She had just suffered the amputation of her second leg as a result of problems with the medical care within the Michigan system. And that's not what I want to tell you about today. What I want to tell you about is what happened when she returned to the prison system from hospitals where she had had the operation. The day that she came back from the prison system, a lab test came back that showed that she had MRSA, a drug-resistant staph infection. And so she needed to be put in some place where, of course, other people wouldn't be at risk from her infection. And so where did the state of Michigan put her? They put her in the segregation unit. And in that segregation unit, here is a woman who hasn't had physical therapy, has had no experience without her second leg, transferring from wheelchair to bed or to toilet, in a segregation cell at one end of a unit at which the correctional officer's desk was at the other end, with no grab bar, with no commode seat, with no ability to quickly or safely change her position in any way, and who has an actively draining leg stump and a MRSA infection. And so what happened over the next days was that because she couldn't get attention quickly enough, she defecated on herself. At one time she had to use the wastebasket as a toilet, for which she was chastised by the nurses. After a few days, she had to be sent out to a hospital for 5 days to have more treatment and to have a tube for her medications installed in her chest. And then she came back and they put her in a different segregation cell, but the segregation cell had the same defects. No accommodations, no ability to shower, cell dirty, and the nurses said, we're not going to change your dressings, you have to change your own dressings. And she was, not surprisingly, depressed from her experience, but also particularly depressed by this horrible situation that she found herself in. She spoke to a mental health worker through her food slot, and she told the mental health worker that she thought staff wanted her to die, and that she felt that she was giving up. She complained to a nurse, the nurse who made rounds, that she was experiencing chest pain and having trouble breathing. What did the nurse record in her record? BS. And the next day, she had a regularly scheduled 3-week appointment back at UW Hospital. Oh, and I forgot one other thing. She had been placed on narcotic medications at UM, and of course, she was cold turkey from the narcotics when she came back to the prison. So she went back for a regular checkup at UM on how she was doing with the new amputation. And while she was there, she experienced a problem breathing and cardiac event, and then spent the next 2 weeks at UM hospitals. Because the warden had sent her to segregation for the crime of being sick. And that is consistent with Michigan policy, and indeed in October of 2012, when Ms. Streeter and I went on an expert tour, in the Haydick's institution. We checked on the cells called the Special Management Housing Unit in the Haydix facility. And that's, yes, that's still where they put the people with MRSA in the system. And I think what this illustrates is that there are two things, there are two kinds of terrible risk to health, at least. When you put people in closed cells, there's there's the architectural barriers that in Michigan, typically it's a solid door with sometimes a window, but under some situations not a window, plus the food slot that opens. And so it greatly restricts communication to and from staff. And all the effects of being closed off psychologically on the person. There are these sorts of intended physical barriers between communication and interaction that segregation entails. But there are also, and I think just as significant, there are the barriers that are psychological. And I've observed this in Michigan and in other systems, and that is that staff, the culture that staff has is a major, that they develop from being in these units and elsewhere is a major problem because, for example, and this is a general feature of medical staff of hundreds and hundreds of medical records I've read from the Michigan system and in other places, the records never refer to the patient. The records always refer to the inmate or the offender, and particularly in the context of segregation, in which prisoner staff typically start with the working assumption that the prisoner is seeking some illegitimate gain by complaining about medical care unless there's some obvious circumstance that supports that. That is how people who might in other circumstances, I can only hope, would be good caring physicians and nurses, can lead to a place that they write down BS, or as a doctor who dealt with Timothy Saunders, who saw urinating on the exam table as a form of misconduct, apparently, and so didn't examine him rather than seeing it as a symptom of stress. That's how people could get there, and so we really need a strategy that will address this, because there are all sorts of people who can end up in segregation, all sorts of health risk. There's the seizure disorders, there's the people who are subject to hypoglycemia, all people with a range of disabilities and a range of medical problems who are greatly at risk. And also, as another huge group of people who are at tremendous risk, there are those who either develop or begin with serious mental illness that interferes with their ability to carry out the activities that they need of eating and drinking and taking care of themselves, so that they become at physical risk. And perhaps that's the most terrible thing about this whole situation, in that Timothy Saunders was not the first case in Michigan of almost the same thing. In the 3 years between 2002 and 2005, 3 other prisoners died in the Michigan system of under very similar circumstances. 2 from exposure in these closed cells to excessive heat in the circumstances in which they weren't taking water and they weren't being appropriately monitored. And a 3rd person who, over a prolonged period, was allowed to starve to death. And so it's going to address this, it's going to take a lot to change the culture. I mean, there's got to be, if Michigan and other places, because Michigan's not alone by any means, wants to change this culture, it's got to start with policy. It's got to start with the availability of enough temperature-controlled beds so that people with special needs are placed in, are not exposed to unsafe housing when it's in these sorts of temperatures. It's got to start with policies so that people who have contagious diseases aren't placed in segregation as an alternative to safe housing. And it's got to include screening policies to make certain that people who will be at unsafe risk aren't placed in that. Of course, there are more effective remedies, and that would be, we could keep everybody out of isolation. That would work a lot better. And the most effective remedy at all, perhaps, would be to markedly, greatly reduce incarceration rates in the country, because if there were a lot fewer people in prison, then it would be a lot easier to take care of everybody safely. Oh.
Thank you. Questions?